we had lined up. The police had given the warnings, given a certain amount of time, 15, 20 minutes, in order to move off. In that same time period, anyway, before the police would actually execute the first tactical options, being the water cannons, there would have been a warning given again that the dispersal action is about to occur. But that was now that was how I envisioned the plan rolling out. The fact that no warnings had been given yet, that the amount of people still left, I don't think is fair to what was envisioned by myself as a planner for that effect.
We wouldn't have got into that situation if the barbed wire had been rolled out as you intended. Do you accept that?
Well, again, I can accept that, but I must also just state that we can't predict the response of the strikers. And that is one of the essences of planning. That you try to, if you've got the time, to go through the what-ifs and to look at the most scenarios that you could to anticipate. But in this case, the plan that we had was the plan that we put forward, and as we're saying, didn't get to its fruition.
You see, Colonel, I mean, we're now on the implementation of the plan, a long way from those three questions. But I do want to finish this section of the cross-examination. It seems to us that the key to your plan was a quick rollout of the barbed wire, so that there would be a barrier between the police and the protesters, so that you could get your vehicles into position and start your dispersal action without a risk of an attack from the protesters to the police in what you called the safe zone, where your police people were not protected. Would you accept that?
Yes.
And if that had happened, your plan may have stood a greater likelihood of succeeding in some level, in some way. We certainly wouldn't have had scene one. You accept that?
It's, it's difficult, because if I agree with you, I wasn't there on the ground to experience the conditions, but theoretically, I accept that.
But once your instruction for a simultaneous rollout was overridden without reference to you, the plan became much, much riskier, because there was now going to be a period of 10 minutes where there wouldn't be a barricade, where the protesters would see that the police are preparing tactical action against them, and they would be likely to respond. You accept that?
Yes.
And from your perspective as a planner, you wanted that barricade up quickly to prevent the protesters crossing the barricade.
That is correct, yes.
So you anticipated that there was a risk that if there wasn't a barricade, the protesters would cross it, for whatever reason, be it to attack the police or just to go home to Wonderkoppen and Kane.
Yes.
So once a decision is taken without reference to you as planner to change what is in fact an important piece of your plan, the risk in implementation of the plan is dramatically increased. You accept that?
Yes.
Maybe if we can go now to the question of time pressure and threats. Yesterday, we referred you to the JOC OB and pointed out that there was, in the period between the morning of the 16th and the 1:30 JOCCOM, where the decision to implement was taken, there was only one threat recorded in the contemporaneous documents, which is the threat at, I think it was 11:30 of the
understand it to be possibly the threat towards Nyala 6, if I look at the time frame, resulting in the removal of Nyala 6, bringing it back towards the police line.
It may or may not be. We can find out. My sense from reading the statements is that it may, in fact, have been a communication. It was a verbal communication, allegedly, from Mr. Noki to the people inside a police Nyala. And my understanding was that that exchange took place between Mr. Noki and Papa 1. We've seen no record of any exchange between Mr. Noki and Papa 6. Not Papa, Mr. Noki and Nyala 6.
Nyala 6. Again, I know you're referring to the contemporaneous documents. I don't think that the threats were limited to what was captured, though, because if we look at the statements of probably McIntosh, Carlitz, and I'm not sure others, we would see that there were, and probably Adria as well, reflecting the view of the media at the time.
Well, let's look at Adria. The rendition of Captain Adria's reported threat in your statement is that it was one of the issues on which the JOCCOM acted at 1:30. Our problem with that is that if you go to the presentation, that threat is reported as having been made after 3:30. I think it's 3:35. In fact, that's after the rollout had started. And if I can get my reference.
Just in there too, what you're looking for is slide 192 of the presentation, Exhibit L. It talks about a threat at 1540, which is set out in the first bullet of that slide. But it talks about earlier comments at 1340, which of course was 10 minutes after the 1330 meeting had started.
That's not the Captain Adria threat with which we're concerned at the moment. That's slide 189, the Captain Adria threat.
The Adria one is slide 170. There he talks about the video operators and the advice he gave them, the result of which they left the scene completely and went to the jock and didn't do any more videography work for the rest of the day. That's slide 170.
That's the video operators being identified as police members. But at slide 189, there is a reference to the threat that I think Colonel Scott is addressing now, which is Captain Adria's report of reporters leaving the scene because they feared for their safety, and this report of a firearm in the blanket.
That's 1535, according to slide 189, long after the 1:30 meeting had started and finished.
And indeed, after the operation, the deadline for the operation to commence had taken place. So that couldn't have been a threat that motivated the decision to act. It was too late.
If it's correct where it's been placed in Exhibit L, yes, I agree with you.
You see, Colonel, you've talked about the process of how Exhibit L grew over time. And we've been through, possibly 15 different drafts of Exhibit L. And from the point at which this allegation enters Exhibit L to the end of Exhibit L, it stays constant as being timed at 1535.
Yes.
There's no suggestion in any of the earlier drafts that it happened at another time. And I would put to you on that basis that if it was alleged to have happened at another time, that would have been conveyed to you in the process.
I understand.
Now, then there are then there is the threat at slide 118. If we can go back to slide 118. And this appears in the sequence between 10:15 and 11:30. And the representatives were informed that the request would be forwarded to the job.
Sorry, Mr. Jackson, this is on. Sorry, this is the Wednesday threat that's come and gone, elicited no proactive operations on the Wednesday, or even early on the Thursday morning. But you can put it to the witness, but don't put it as if that was on Thursday. It's Wednesday.
Beg your pardon, I'm putting the wrong thread. If we can go to 192. Chairperson, that's the thread to which you referred us a little earlier. Brigadier Carlitz gave a command to Colonel Makubela to start with the deployment of the barbed wire. When the first Nyala started to deploy the barbed wire, one of these representatives came to the front window of the negotiation Nyala and stated, "These hippos would not leave this place and you will all die today," brackets interpreter, and he'd not be returning again. This followed his earlier comments made at about 1340, where he approached the Nyala and said that we can see that SAPs are now making ready for war. He informed Lieutenant Colonel McIntosh that we must sign a paper so that the world can see how we will kill one another today. That's alleged to have happened at 1340. No, the first threat, the 1540 is these hippos would not leave this place and you'll all die today. That, of course, is once the operation is already rolling out. So that doesn't explain why the operation rolls out. And then the alleged earlier threat is that at 1340 on the day, we must sign a paper so the world can see how we will kill one another today. Now, we've managed, in one of the very early drafts of the presentation, which is J 34. Can we call up J 34?
Is this an exhibit yet, or must I?
It will be an exhibit, J 34. It hasn't been exhibited yet.
How do I describe it? Early draft of SAPS presentation. Can I describe it? Must I describe it more particularly than that?
Last saved on 27 August 2012.
27 August.
27 August 2012.
Last save. That was that the first day of the Roots meeting?
Indeed, Chairperson. Now, Colonel, this draft is a draft that, well, we assume that you prepared. Do you recognize the document?
Yes.
And its date is 27 August. That was the first day of Roots.
Okay, yes.
Did you present it at Roots on the first day?
Well, I don't recall.
You compile it?
I would have, Chairperson. I know I started already the week before Roots with the police presentation. So I was working on it from then.
Based upon not only your own knowledge, obviously, but information received from others?
Yes.
Because in this document, there's a very different rendition of the threat. If one goes to page 31, can we scroll up to page 31 of the document? There what you said is this. At 1537, the leader of the militant group approached the police armored vehicle line telling Brigadier Carlitz, the protesters have made a contract that they would not lay down their arms and were willing to die there that day. There was no turning back. And that's put in inverted commas. That's very different from a contract that we must all kill each other, is it not?
Like I say, the inputs that are in the documents are what I received from the members. So,
the question they put to you is there's a significant difference between the statement in L that there would be a contract, as it were, with two parties, one side the police, the other side the strikers, and they will sign a paper and agree they'll kill one another today, which is what appears in slide 192 in Exhibit L. That's very different from what we see here in this new exhibit, Triple J 34 at page 31, I think it is. There it's only a contract among the strikers themselves, and they're agreeing with each other that they won't lay down their arms and they're willing to die there. There's no turning back. That's right.
yes, I understand that, Chairperson.
Now, in this draft of 27 August, I stand subject to correction, but I think that's the only threat that is contained within the document.
Well, like I say again, it's a draft document. So this is how the document grew, because as we had access to getting more inputs from more members, and as you've rightfully said, this is made before we got to Potchefstroom where the commanders were called together. So one would need to see whether somebody like Lieutenant Colonel McIntosh, who was the negotiator, who was dealing with most of and giving the inputs on what the threats were, was even present after the operation. I'm not sure that his services were still needed until he got to Roots to give further input.
I have two responses to that. The first is that somebody told you that Mr. Norkie conveyed to Brigadier Carlitz, and here's a quotation, the protesters have made a contract that they would not lay down their arms and were willing to die there that day. There was no turning back. Because you put that in there. You accept that?
Yes.
Who was that person? Who reported Mr. Norkie's statement in these terms?
Well, look, you're asking a question now of over a year ago, but I can only imagine it would have been somebody from that vehicle, possibly Brigadier Carlitz himself.
Indeed. So the operational commander, if your supposition is correct, believed that what the threat was, to the extent that it was a threat, was not that people were going to kill the police. It was that they had decided that they weren't going to lay down their arms and were willing to die there today. There was no turning back. That would have reflected what the operational commander believed at the time.
That is so. I'm just trying to read into how you're interpreting that they were not willing to lay down their arms and were willing to die there that day. That has to be them anticipating that the police are going to take action against them, and that they would resist that action to the degree that the police would need to defend themselves.
Colonel,
because why else would the police...
Sorry. According to this, it looks as if Brigadier Carlitz must have told you that, because you yes. say they told Brigadier Carlitz and then the quotation marks appear. But the time is interesting. It's 1537. Now, 1535 gives us the context. The AMCU, the previous bullet, the AMCU president left the group of protesters after asking them to refrain from continuing with their planned action as they were going to die. So, according to this, Mr. Matunji had said to them, and we know he gave evidence about what he told them, you must leave, otherwise you're going to die. And their response, according to this document, was once he'd gone, say to Brigadier Carlitz, well, we've made a contract, we're not going to lay out our arms, and we're willing to die. There's no turning back. That's the context in which that statement appears, isn't it?
Yes.
Whether it's right or wrong, we don't know yet, but that was an early version of the police version, is that right?
Yes.
But, Colonel, I have a second point to put to you, which is that this whole line of questioning started with issues around time constraints and the need to act in the face of a threat. Now, this is the 27th of August when you produce this document. It is 11 days after the event, and the only trace of a threat that required immediate response in the document is that statement that we see on the third bullet point of this slide. Surely if there were material threats that had been conveyed and that had essentially been the cause of the police decision to move to phase 3 and to move to phase 3 quickly, there'd have been some trace of them in this document that you prepared.
I hear you, and again, I can only put in what I'm given. So I was aware on the day, as I say, being in the jock, just hearing the chatter in the jock, that there were threats that were made towards the police. That much I can say I was aware, and this was still mid-late morning when that was the case. Maybe it is the one that is commented in the OB, I'm not sure.
There definitely was a threat of sorts in the morning, around about 11:30, with the OB entry, where it was reported that Mr. Noki wanted the barbed wire trailers removed and that he was very aggressive. But it's reported in terms that don't approximate anything that emerges in these later renditions in the presentation. You accept that?
Yes.
And if you were putting together a presentation that was designed to explain how and why the police acted when they did, and how they did, 11 days after the event, when events were still fairly fresh in your memory, surely if there were a range of threats that had been material in a causal sense, you would have included them in this presentation.
Again, being the part of the compiler at this stage of some of the written inputs, it's a draft document which is in working. So you're not looking at a completed document. And as I get access to more information, so the information gets included. So we can't look at this as something that was in a finalized state by the 27th of August. It grew slowly and it grew over time, right up until, as we know, probably the first week of November.
I can understand that answer in relation to facts that were not within your knowledge. But in relation to...
But if I can just then say to where you're going, it's not to me, if we look there, it's almost verbatim, if that was Brigadier Carlitz giving his explanation. For me to have worked on a perception, because we worked through obviously a similar hierarchy. The commanders would speak to the members would speak to their commanders, give them their inputs, the commanders would verify what they've experienced, and they would bring it back to the compilers of the presentation. So over time, obviously, we were going to get what the threats were, possibly if they were made to Nyala 6, knowing that there were more junior members inside Nyala 6, who would speak to their commanders, speak to Colonel Makubela, to Carlitz, etc., and come to us. This is only at a time period afterwards, where not everything has been collated at this time yet. Thus the beginning of Roots, because we're still going to get most of the inputs at Roots. And again, even if I was hearsay aware of some of the threats, it was not my place to, out of my hearsay, go and place them into a presentation at that time. They needed to be put in or given as input by the actual people that experienced them.
I still put it to you that it is very odd that in this draft of a presentation on the 27th of August, you saw fit to mention only one threat, which is a threat that is in very different terms from the threat that is later conveyed. And there is nothing in this presentation to suggest a causally relevant threat at any stage prior to, never mind the decision to move to the tactical phase, in fact, the actual rolling out of the tactical phase? You can respond to that if you want, or we can move further.
I think I've exhausted the topic. But I think maybe...
Are you going to deal with the 11:30 threat, or whatever, or aggressive behaviour, whatever one chooses to describe it?
We have
The reason I ask is this question I want to ask, but if you're going to cover the topic, I won't.
I don't intend to revisit it. I've made...
Well, maybe I must ask my question. You originally, as I understand it, you had various members of the service in the forward holding areas, out of sight of the people on the copy. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct, Chairperson.
And one of the reasons for that, I think, in one of your plans is you thought that if they were visible, that might be provocative in a way. Is that correct?
In a phase 1 deployment, yes.
Yes, that's right. Now, I noticed from slide 159 to Exhibit L that something interesting happened at 11:30, roughly the time when that aggressive action that we heard about took place. Firstly, we know already, this is not in 159, slide 159, but we know that the trailers with the Nyalas with the wired trailers were brought onto the scene.
Yes.
They were pre-positioned.
Yes.
But secondly, according to 159, slide 159, on request from the operational commander in the neutral area, that I take it is Carlitz,
Yes.
additional armoured vehicles were deployed by the JOC from the reserve reaction groups at forward holding area 1 and 2. 21 TRT members from forward holding area A, forward holding area 1, and 41 POP members in armoured vehicles from forward holding area 2.
That's correct, Chairperson.
So you not brought them onto the scene previously for fear that might have some kind of provocative effect.
They were supposed to... one always has to maintain a reserve, always, in case something happens elsewhere. So they were, as part of the reserve, the ideal was, again, to bring on a show of force that day. But I do understand that they were positioned at the forward holding areas, and they were requested, at the request of Brigadier Carlitz, who was feeling volatile, he was feeling vulnerable at the time.
Thank you.
Colonel, the changing of the narrative as regards what was said by Mr. Noki to the members inside the Nyala, would you have been responsible for changing that narrative?
No, ma'am.
Who would have?
It would have been inputs directly from commanders. I've also been pondering that, looking at that, wondering whether maybe Brigadier Carlitz didn't consult with people in his Nyala, like Colonel McIntosh, when they got together at Roots to get a more accurate version. I can't say, I'm speculating now, but we wouldn't put something in myself out of hearsay. And hereafter, it's mostly Colonel Visser that started dealing with the members themselves, gaining the inputs from members.
So the version as it appears in Exhibit L before us would have been drafted by Colonel Visser?
He would have typed it in, but he would have got the input definitely from the commanders, ma'am.
Yes, thank you.
Colonel, I'd like to pick up on something flowing from the chairperson's question. If we can maybe go to slide 149, which shows your planned deployment for phase 2. What I note from this deployment is that your plan for where the Nyalas were going to position in phase 2 was to put them at quite a distance away from the Kopi. Was there a reason for this?
Again, it was part of a non-conflict strategy. It made no sense to have the police positioned closer to the strikers or the crowd than would be necessary. And I'm not sure if you can see the first red vehicle at the bottom, which is on the corner of the power station. Now, in the planning thereof, making use already of the power station as a natural boundary to the south, that would also gain ground, which would extend the line further around to help block off the advance towards Nkaning settlement. It's those small type of things that I would consider when placing vehicles and so on. And now I know they didn't follow that and that they went to the inside, but from what I understand, where the vehicles are standing now is actually where the police was deployed, the monitoring and negotiation group, and they wanted them, obviously, the razor wire to be in front. Also, I believe that the power pylons played a role, that Brigadier Karlitz had to move certain of his forces, his own line, because of the radio communication problem standing directly underneath some of the pylons, that they couldn't transmit.
Well, you partially addressed the question that's coming later, but can I ask you to look at Exhibit J91, which is where the diagram, and I emphasize it's a rough diagram, we don't maintain that it's absolutely accurate, where we've tried to map onto this grid the actual deployment of the barbed wire nyalas on the day. And there are two features of this that I would want to raise with you. The first is that in terms of your rationale of keeping the barbed wire nyalas away from the protesters on the Kopi so as not to provoke an unnecessary confrontation, the barbed wire nyalas deployed a great deal closer to the Kopi than was your plan. You accept that? Start at the beginning. Do you accept that we've plotted these vehicles broadly correctly?
Yes. I'm just wondering, the word great deal is maybe, if I can see, 40, possibly 50 meters closer.
Well,
at the furthest point.
If we go back to what I think was slide 181 of the presentation, we'll see that 40 meters is a substantial distance in that context. Can we go to slide 191? Sorry, 180. It's a 191. 191. So the total distance between the protesters and the negotiation group, according to this diagram of yours, is roughly 80 meters.
Yes.
And your barbed wire nyalas ended up being deployed as much as 50 meters, you said, closer to the mountain than you had intended.
At the furthest point, obviously it narrows as it gets closer to the top of the line. But I agree with you. There's distance. Obviously, they are closer.
Was any of this deviation from your plan discussed with you?
No. The positioning of the vehicles, as you can see them there, no, it wasn't discussed to move to a closer positioning. No.
Did you not notice it during the day?
Well, by the time I needed to brief the commanders, I'd got aerial photography which showed the new deployment positions, and from my recollection, I'd replaced where the nyalas were now for a better briefing for the phase 3. By that late stage, yes.
You say replaced, you mean replaced on your Google Earth
Google
map?
Yes.
Can we go back to J91? You see, and again, we're leaping forward to one of the pieces of evidence that we raised with you yesterday, but I do want to raise it now once we've got it up in front of you. It does strike us as odd that the particular place where Nyala's 3, 4, 5, and 6 chose to position themselves was on the blue line that on your copy plan, your encirclement plan was the barbed wire cordon. Do you have any answer to that?
No. I think that Colonel Makabela would need to answer that.
And we know from Colonel Makubela's statement 3 days after the event that he thought what he was supposed to do is to encircle the copy with barbed wire.
I understand his first statement says that, yes. Chairperson, I don't know if I can elaborate just on that point as well.
You have the fullest right to do so if you consider it necessary.
Yes, it's just when we talk encirclement in general means you encircle, close a circle around something. And I mean, it's evident from the positioning of those vehicles that they're in a straight line. There is approximately maybe just short of 180 meters, 180 degrees of movement still available to the strikers. So, and I do believe that in his second statement he did mention it's a matter of terminology and possibly maybe not being a first language, etc. Possibly even in his briefings when he carried it over. I'm speculating now, but what is evident though is that that's definitely not a prepositioning for encirclement.
Well, let's go to Colonel Makubela's statement. Triple G9. If we can call up Triple G9. You see, it's not just in one place that Colonel Makubela talks about what he thought the plan was. If we go to paragraph 2, he says, during the said operation, my task was to surround the said employees with barbed wire at the place they'd gathered at a small hill near Wonderkop village. That, to our mind, speaks to the encirclement plan, but it's really put beyond doubt by paragraph 6. I also state that the aim to use the barbed wire was to manage to control the said employees to be searched as only one entrance or exit was to be made for the weapons they were having. Now, a feature of your encirclement plan was that there was going to be a processing zone with only one exit for the miners to come out and be disarmed. That's correct?
That's correct.
Was it any feature of your dispersal and disarm plan, that only one entrance or exit was to be made for the weapons that the miners were having?
No. Again, I don't want to speculate, but I think we are speculating without his presence on what he's meaning. But the flushing out of the greater amount of protesters towards the west is also in essence channeled through a wider area. Because if he's made this statement after pre-positioning his vehicles the way he did, surely he has to understand that he's not encircling, closing.
Only one exit. The two words that are relevant, firstly the word surround, which we find in para 2, and then in para 6, there's talk about only one entrance or exit. Now, you can only have only one entrance or exit, as I assume, if you've got a circle with a little hole, with a little space at some point. Is that right?
Yes, Chairperson.
Well, if words have any meaning, that's what they mean.
That's why
I'm speculation.
Yeah.
That's what he says.
Well, that's why I've said I'm not sure if he's understanding or he's translating it back into the English language properly has done justification to his understanding. Because I don't see how that could happen with the positioning of his vehicles. And he knows that too, because you could not make Nyala 6 stretch from where it was all the way around to the bottom. It was just never going to happen.
But Colonel, remember we're talking about phase 2 here, not phase 3. That positioning was a phase 2 positioning, not a phase 3 positioning.
Yes.
And a phase 2 positioning had two purposes. One was a pre-positioning, and the other was a show of force.
Yes. And
if we go back to your slide, 149,
but just in saying that, there is why, that's one of the reasons why the dispersal to arrest plan has to have been in place by that morning, because with my laying out of the vehicles the way they were pre-positioned as a contingency plan, but also as the deployment plan for a phase 3, if it was going to occur.
Indeed, Colonel, you did raise this at one stage earlier in September, but you recall we had an exchange on this, and ultimately you did concede that this layout was not in any material respects different from what the phase 2 layout would have been on the Tuesday version of the plan. You recall that exchange? I
believe, yes, and the chairperson did also raise it, that it may have been hindsight from my side that I had actually gone too far back with the strategizing, that the strategy of this done on the Wednesday was brought back onto the Tuesday in the statement.
No, we're at cross purposes, Colonel. We were talking specifically about the passage in your statement where you talk about the phase 2 version of the encirclement plan. In the statement, when you talk about phase 2 Tuesday version, I can find the references, I don't have them at my fingertips. You're talking very much about phase 2 of the encirclement plan. And you'll recall we had a lengthy exchange using SS3. And the plan, the phase 2 plan in SS3 at encirclement stage, which matched that diagram, and you did concede, now the record will speak for itself, that this diagram that we see up here is not in any material respects different from what phase 2, the Tuesday version, would have been on the encirclement plan.
I fail to understand where you're going, because what the diagram we've got up now have elements in it that were created from the outset. But the actual diagram as we see it there was only created on the Thursday morning.
I know it was only created on the Thursday morning. What I want to put you is that's neutral in relation to whether the plan on Thursday morning was encirclement or disperse and disarm. I mean, you've already conceded that it is at least possible that at the end of the JOCCOM meeting on Thursday, whether it was going to be encirclement or disperse and disarm was still
There's a possibility that it was in the air, yes.
Yes. Now that being, and we know that that is what you handed to people at the Thursday JOCCOM as the phase 2 deployment.
Yes. And we're talking about this morning, when I was speaking this morning.
This morning. Never mind the September exchange on whether this was...
Yes, and I was giving a basic synopsis that a possibility exists, that because the generals were removed from the JOCCOM before the end of the JOCCOM was concluded, that there was no hard decision taken on, and again, I was working out of a possibility of what could have occurred. But, and that the fact there was actually that encirclement was brought to the JOCCOM still, as well as the new strategy of disperse to arrest. But that the decision to go tactical, for that matter, on which one or the detail thereof was not laid out before the JOC for deep input, etc. So, but the fact that this document exists, to me, is proof that there was a stage 2, as we can see it, obviously. And I know that I placed those vehicles with a pre-positioning for a stage 3. It's one of the reasons to actually have put them in place. that should a stage 3 be called for on that day, that it would be necessary to have them there, because it complemented the stage 3 plan.
Well, Colonel, I don't want to go back to a topic that we spent the better part of a morning on a month ago, but that cross-examination ended up with you accepting that this diagram did not differ in any material respects from the diagram that would have described the phase 2 version for encirclement on the Tuesday.
But what I'm failing to understand is there was no phase 2 encirclement on Tuesday.
The phase 2 plan, what would have been a phase 2 plan had it been put in place on Tuesday. It's what you say in your statement.
Tuesday's show of force.
Tuesday's phase 2.
Which was also still the show of force.
But you also describe it in your statement not just as a show of force, but also as a prepositioning.
But that's, I know, but it's not, I don't want to get into the argument about it, but that's where the chairperson rightfully said, are you not maybe considering something that you thought of later, and you've mentioned it now on Tuesday, where you hadn't yet considered it on the Tuesday, which I conceded to saying yes.
I think we'll have to leave the record to speak for itself on that one.
Just ask you something, Colonel, about what Colonel Makabela said about that positioning on slide 149 being part of an encirclement. Now, to do an encirclement of that area, would you have needed more nyalas with barbed wire?
You would have, ma'am.
And who would have been in command of those other extra nyalas for the encirclement?
It would have still been Colonel Makabela. If he was there, ideally he would have been the razor wire or encirclement group for that matter. And if it was still going to be an encirclement strategy, again, it would have been a dual rollout at least, or a simultaneous rollout if one could manage that. And then obviously he would have given the instruction. If it was a dual rollout, he may have had 2 commanders he would have spoken to. If it was simultaneous, he would have got in touch with all his commanders per vehicle to give the instruction to do so.
Yes, thank you.
I remember from the diagrams we saw earlier, there were, as far as I remember, 2 semicircles that joined. One was blue, I think, and the other was green, was orange.
Orange.
So obviously, one set of nyalas would have gone in one direction,
Yes.
from the top of the circle down to the bottom of the circle, and the other would have gone from the bottom of the circle on the other side.
Yes.
From on the bottom of the circle to the top of the circle.
Yes.
That's right. Now, presumably, well, no, perhaps presumably is too strong a word, but would it be correct to say that one person would have been in charge of the upward moving group of nyalas, and another the downward moving group of nyalas, if you understand what I mean?
Chairperson, yes. Ultimately, that would be what would occur. Of course, being the first light plan, the initial smaller...
Yes, I understand. The circle would have been smaller. Do you know who the 2 people would have been? Would Makabela have been in charge of the whole operation, or would he have been in charge of, perhaps also in charge of one of the semicircle creating groups of nyalas?
Chairperson, if it wasn't planned to that detail because it didn't occur, but if it was, I would imagine that him being a full colonel, he would have had 2 lieutenant colonels, which were within his ranks, and he would have instructed them on taking a side of the Kopi each, with a responsibility to each. Or possibly himself taking one of the sides with another lieutenant colonel taking the opposite side.
And the result of plotting slide 152 on 149 is that one semicircle, in fact, instead of doing what we see on what you planned on 149, we see one of the 2 semicircles. Do I understand that correctly? Not the other one, but one of them.
Yes, we're seeing more or less one of them, yes.
Yeah. Justice, is this a convenient stage for us to take the adjournment, or is there some other question you wish to ask before we do that?
Not on this topic, Chair.
Right, we'll take the tea adjournment at this stage.
consulting colleagues that were there, and they verified that the Provincial Commissioner did open and did speak to the JOCOM. So it's with that hindsight as well that or with that interaction that I say as I've said as well.
But my question is slightly different. It's you say you don't know who took that decision. Is it safe for us to say then that it wasn't taken at the JOCOM where you were present? The decision wasn't taken.
Well, what I've said is I don't recall the wording used by the Provincial Commissioner. From what I'm understanding, she carried it over at the JOCOM. And I'm in no way trying to protect anybody, but there was no mention there of a national management forum, etc. So,
Colonel, I'm not asking you to speculate as to who did take the decision. You've said you don't know who took. Yeah. I'm asking a simple question. Can we accept that it wasn't taken at the JOCOM? It had already been taken, whether by Major General Annandale, Major General Mpembe, as he has testified, the Provincial Commissioner, anybody, but it had been taken by the time the 130 JOCOM convened.
Yes.
You see, my concern with that is that it was only at the 130 JOCOM that any detail was given to the tactical phase of the plan. We dealt with that, I think, on the last day before we broke. You recall that?
Yes, that's my recollection. I can't speak as to what others may have experienced at the 6 o'clock JOCOM. There may be those that say that it was not discussed in depth or detail, but mentioned there, and there may have been one or two comments, but I don't recall them.
So, but from what you recall, and if we put together what you recall, a decision was taken to move to a Phase 3 dispersal and disarmament tactical phase before any detail to that phase had been communicated in the JOC. Is that correct?
The detail, that's correct.
So the high-risk tactical intervention was ordered or decided before the decision makers knew how it would be implemented.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what they knew at their level. As I say, I reported to General Annandale what was communicated from that time forward. He could have, on Wednesday already, been communicating that there was an issue and we were looking to clear it with the JOCOM, for instance, that a dispersal action would be the order of the day and not an encirclement. But I wasn't privileged to, obviously, the higher level communications and decision-making processes based on communications that were going on.
But you...
So, Mr. Semenya, you indicated, I think, that you wished to say something?
Well, I see the witness has already answered. I don't know the decision makers. I was trying to establish which decision makers Mr. Chaskelson was referring to.
My question is independent of the identity of the decision makers.
He's made his comment. He's put it on record. Carry on.
But your testimony was that the first time detail was given to the tactical phase that was implemented was at the 130 JOCOM by you.
That's correct.
And that no aspects of the detail that you put forward were rejected or changed in any material respects by any of the people present there.
That's correct.
And the decision had been taken before that took place.
That's correct.
If we can then move back to the first question, because here there is quite a lot of detail that I do need to canvass with you just to clarify the basis for your testimony that you still think it was on Thursday morning. And you'll recall there were, I forget how many, I gave you a printout of them last night of what led us to believe that this took place later on the Thursday. Can we now take them one by one? And if we start with your testimony, on your own admission, for many months, you recalled that conversations relating to the difficulties of the encirclement plan had took place only on Thursday. If not for many months, then at least until you went to Roots.
That's the best that I can recall, yes.
Now, I want to explore how it could be possible that that would be your memory up to Roots and it would be an incorrect memory. The Marikana operation left 34 people dead. As I've said already, that in this cross-examination, that's more people than have been killed by the SAPs in a single operation since Sharpeville. It dominated local news and international news for days. You were the primary planner of the operation that had these consequences. And the plan that was ultimately implemented, it ended up with these unfortunate, tragic consequences, was one that had been changed because difficulties were identified with an earlier plan. That's your testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Chair, I object to that proposition. We are still yet to establish whether those consequences are a result of the flaw in the plan. To put it as a proposition to the witness that you are the planner, primary planner, that resulted in those consequences is a subject yet to be explored.
Chair, what I put to the witness was that he was the primary planner of the operation that had these consequences. Why the consequences flowed from the operation, whether they were a direct result of his plan or not, is not part of my question.
Take it, provided that point is clear, Mr. Semenya will not persist in his objection, but he has made a point, he's put his marker down on the ground, and we'll know that what his attitude will be if it's approached again.
So, to get back to my sequence, you only started thinking about the new plan that was ultimately, at least attempted to be implemented, after you'd identified difficulties with the old plan.
Yes.
And you say for many months, or at least until Roots, your recall was that those difficulties with the old plan had only been identified on the Thursday morning, not on the Wednesday morning.
I've said that, and what I've also mentioned was that that time period felt like an extended time period where I was actually quite sure we were missing a day. Maybe it was due to the long hours being worked, but that it actually felt as though we were one day short.
You did say that. One of the questions we may have to decide at the end of the day is whether your original memory was right and your later reconstruction is wrong, or vice versa. But the two possibilities are on the table. And
Yes.
it's something we'll have to think about very carefully in the light of all the evidence.
Yes,
That's
Chairperson,
right.
I prepared almost something that last night that speaks to these type of incidents, which I'm not sure if I can share or not share. I have mentioned it before, but it was just due to the fact of after the day of the 16th, immediately trying to prepare a plan to reflect, understanding that I would have senior police officers coming to want to know what had gone on and so on. But that just being the beginning, immediately being tasked and thereafter tasked with 9 taskings before the end of that week, the following week. Some of them which were, as I say, pretty extraneous taskings, briefings to the President, brief letters to be sent to the President, ministerial committees, portfolio committees. So my time of actually being able to go back and reflect accurately was mostly taken up with having to address a number of, in fact, 9 other taskings that I'd received.
Yes, but what was put to you, amongst other things, was your presentation to the President or the Minister, I can't remember which it was yesterday. And that was obviously a very important task that you had to perform. And you had to the best of your ability, put the facts correctly to the President and the Minister. That's right.
Yes, well, with respect to the President, if you actually, the plan that has got saved with the plan in it is his original presentation, but saved later. He never got to see the plan in his presentation. He saw the same plan the media saw,
I see, but
the same presentation.
prepared for him and shown to the minister. Is that right?
No, I didn't prepare the plan for the president.
No, not the plan, the slide or whatever it was. You prepared a presentation
Yes.
for the minister, for the president. Do I understand you correctly? You didn't give him the whole presentation, but you did, in due course, give that presentation to the minister. Am I understanding that correctly?
I did also brief the president.
Yes, no, you said you did. I thought you said you didn't show him everything.
No,
I may have misunderstood.
I showed him
I'm trying to find out what I should have understood.
I showed him the same presentation as was shown to the media that day. After that, I started building in the plan from what I tried to reconstruct from the Thursday night.
Thank you, I now understand.
I mean, at an appropriate point, and it may be when I'm taking you to the individual documents, you must feel free to put on record what you prepared last night or whatever's relevant to the question. But I do just want to emphasize what our difficulty is so that you can confront it. It is, if the difficulties in the encirclement plan were identified only on the Thursday morning, that would mean that you started thinking about the new plan only sometime on the Thursday morning, which would be at best a few hours before it was adopted at the 1:30 JOCCOM. And that would mean that your memory on say the 19th, which is when you produce some of these documents, that you'd only spent a few hours between first thinking about that plan and the 1:30 JOCCOM and then another 2 hours before it was implemented, was out by a full 24 hours. It wasn't a plan that had been germinating in total for, say, 5 hours. It was a plan that had been germinating for a day and 5 hours.
Yes.
And that seems quite a substantial difference to us. Quite a substantial difference to get wrong when you're trying to remember it barely a couple of days after the event. So that's our concern. Do you want to respond to that now, or should we take the specific documents so that you can respond to them?
Maybe we can move through them. As I say, I mentioned it before. As I say, I can remember these incidents and the conversations we had and so on, but to have placed them on what specific day was difficult for me. It was only due to the presence of members that were either there on that day or not there the next day that I actually got to see that I was out by a day. So I'm relying on that. Whether there was another conversation without, for instance, Brigadier Engelbrecht being present, then it may have been on the Thursday. But if Brigadier Engelbrecht is part of that, it has to have been when he was there, which would have been on the Wednesday. And then thereafter stimulated my thinking into the processes.
You see what Brigadier Engelbrecht describes in his statement is not a discussion about the weaknesses of the plan.
Yes.
It's merely a discussion about the detail of the encirclement plan.
Yes.
So it's quite possible, we can canvass this further with Brigadier Engelbrecht, that he was not party to any discussion about the weaknesses of the plan.
I understand that too. And as I was saying, I'm quite happy to either way. If the thought processes were on the Wednesday, then that's when it did happen. If it was only on the Thursday, then that's when it did happen. I know that it did happen. I just have difficulty in placing it to which day specifically.
Well, maybe it's, the evidence is there, and maybe we should just leave it at that. You accept that it's possible that it happened on the Thursday, not on the Wednesday. You can't recall today with any certainty. It could be possible,
because if I look at the contemporaneous notes from that JOCCOM of the 6 o'clock of the Thursday, if it was mentioned there that today something has to happen because we can't continue, I don't recall that, but it's possible that I would have then gone into the thinking mode which I'm describing in my statement.
From my perspective, I'm happy to leave it on that level, unless there is anything. You've had the full text of what I recited yesterday afternoon. if there's anything there that's clearly wrong and that we need to, I don't want to make submissions to the chairperson and the commissioners that are clearly wrong. So if there's anything to respond to in that, to draw my attention to an obvious error or something like that, please do. Otherwise, let's leave it on that basis.
Okay. I don't think there is at this time. The only thing I could work out as to why I had still looked at encirclement for the Thursday morning was because at that time, with all the other taskings, as I'm saying, which did play a role in what took up my time and my energy, was the fact that I had to go back to some form of contemporaneous note, which would have been the JOCOM or the plan at that time that was coming from the Thursday morning. And if that was still speaking to encirclement, although this dispersion could have been discussed on the Wednesday already, but waiting for a JOCOM decision to amend, I would have been thinking that encirclement went all the way. But I do know that the detail, as I said, of that encirclement plan was for the 1:30 meeting.
Well, Colonel, I'm happy to leave it on that basis. But there is unfortunately one issue which I do need to canvass with you because it's a material issue that the Commission may have to consider, and that is what I've identified as what I say the obvious flaw in the plan. And can we go there? And you've seen what my reasoning is in that regard, and I do want to emphasize, I'm not suggesting that this was a deliberate setup in the plan. I'm suggesting, on the contrary, that this was a flaw in the plan that you would have picked up if you had a reasonable amount of time to consider it, and the fact that you didn't pick it up gives rise to a strong inference that the plan was prepared in such haste that you couldn't reflect, you didn't have time to reflect on it. But let's go through it. Or maybe let's ask at the start, do you accept that that was a flaw in the plan?
I accept that it was not covered maybe in the detail that it should have been, but again, myself as the planner not having the privilege of actually being there to see, I was relying on verbal feedback, amongst others, from some of my teams that hadn't been able to get too close to copy 3 for that matter. But I think if we go through it, I don't necessarily agree with everything that you are saying, because
then I think we must go through it.
Yeah.
So let's take it step by step. Do you accept that objectively the terrain on copy 3 is such that it would be very difficult to clear that terrain if striking miners entrench themselves in copy 3?
Obviously this is a hindsight question now, and not what I knew at the time.
The question is, as Mr. Chesterton explained at the very beginning, not intended to suggest anything about what you subjectively thought at the time. The word calculator used yesterday was used in the objective sense. So it is a hindsight question in the sense that one has to consider not what you intended at the time, but looking at it now, with hindsight, which we all know is 2020, whether you now see things that you didn't see at the time. I think that's the basis of the question. Is that correct, Mr. Chesterton?
Where I refer to subjective knowledge at the time, I will make that absolutely clear, unless I do assume that we're talking about objective facts, not what your subjective knowledge was at the time. So the first question is, objectively, do you accept, not did you know at the time, but objectively, do you accept that the terrain on copy 3 is such that it would be very difficult to clear if striking miners entrench themselves there?
What I would say to that is, for units that are not trained to do that, amongst others, I don't know if all the public order policing units are trained to do that. There could be public order policemen from maybe a decade or more ago that would have been trained in similar techniques, but today's POPs is not taught to necessarily go and clear areas like that. But for units such as TRT, NIU and SDF, they are taught in their training curriculums how to move through environments like that, to sweep through, to look for perpetrators, suspects, and to enforce arrests in environments like that.
Yes, I'm not suggesting it's impossible. But let's
But
put the question differently. Do you accept that the terrain on copy 3 would be no easier to clear than the terrain on copies 1 and 2?
Yes.
Do you accept that it would be more difficult to clear than copies 1 and 2 because it's less exposed?
No. I think that the height advantage on copy 1 poses a bigger threat to copy 1 had similar bushes, trees, and the height effect going on to the southwestern side. And that's specifically why I moved the Special Task Force and the NIU to doing that copy 1 in the plan.
Now it's a subjective question. Do you accept that you knew...
I think you mean, subject.
Subjective. Do you accept that you subjectively knew about the terrain on copy 3 because you'd received a report on the difficulties of that terrain from the SDF observation team on Tuesday?
Yes, and that on the Tuesday when I'd sent them there, I'd done the Google Earth map lookout, and I'd expected that to be a similar copies to 1 and 2. But one of the difficulties, and when I speak difficulties for an observation post, it's a difficulty because there wasn't sufficient height, and with an observation post you would want height. That was one of the difficulties, and the other was the human movement through or backwards and forwards that they had picked up. So there was too much human movement for them to have established an observation post there, which is supposed to be more in a clandestine role.
And if we go to your statement, what they also reported to you is that there were small trees, bushes, and large rocks on copy 3.
Yes.
Which would also pose difficulties in terms of terrain for clearing people.
Well, obviously that's more difficult to clear than open ground, yes.
And you've already accepted that from the same report you knew that there was movement between copies 1 and copies 3, and that the strikers at any rate moved between, well, some of the strikers moved to copy 3, if they were moving between 3 and 1.
This was the report I received, yes.
Now, this is not a subjective question now. Now we're back to the objective. Do you accept that the structure of your dispersal plan was such that a likely effect of it, if it was successful, in relation to copies 1 and 2, not overall, but just in relation to copies 1 and 2, is that striking miners would be driven west of copies 1 and 2, inter alia in the direction of copy 3?
I think copy 3 was maybe, maybe we can bring up slide 181 of the presentation, Al. And that's just to show the positionings of the vehicles and where the expected dispersion flanks were supposed to move towards. And maybe if I speak subjectively for a moment, it was envisioned that they would move between copy 3 and the power station into the wider open area. Because persons that are being dispersed and that are now voluntarily moving, whether through the warning or through the dispersal force continuum, would be trying to move further away from the police and not necessarily trying to move to a rendezvous point or to bunker down to set up an vantage point against police moving towards them. I didn't anticipate that they would go towards copy 3. As I say, I thought the militant group would take up refuge either on copy 1 or be broken into smaller groups and try to regroup somewhere in the open fields further to the west.
But do you accept that objectively, if you push people to the west, they're either going to, from that situation, they're either going to end up to the south of copy 3 or in copy 3?
Objectively, yes. But as I say, my questioning is why they would want to necessarily go to copy 3 unless they had a modus operandi set up against the police again.
if you're dealing at least with a group of militant protesters who you anticipated would not just simply disperse, there is a real risk that if you push them off copies 1 and 2, unless you cut them off from copy 3, they will regroup in copy 3. Would you accept that?
Yes.
And we know that your plan provided very detailed measures for how the tactical forces were to be deployed to ensure that if strikers entrenched themselves on 1 and 2, the tactical forces who had the necessary training would go in and would be able to get them out of there.
That's correct.
But your plan included no measures of that nature for copy 3.
No. If I speak subjectively again, or back to the time period, my anticipation was that once the initial drive had taken place to disperse, and there would be a follow-up action of arrest teams behind the public order dispersion line, that would be seen as an operation in itself, because from there we wouldn't be sure what the strikers would be doing, whether they would be moving in, specifically we were hoping again towards the west into the open ground. But that was why, to lay down a specific plan at that stage, not knowing what the strikers would do. And again, as you quite rightly have stated, with more time, more what-ifs get involved, and you start considering the what-ifs. But it wasn't at that stage anticipated that they would move to copy 3, for that matter.
Well, it goes a little bit further than that, Colonel, because if we go to slide 229, can we just go through to 229? That's a slide which describes your reorganizations line.
That's correct.
So your plan, in fact, required the SAP's forces to stop at that yellow line between copies 1 and 2 on the right-hand side to the east and copy 3 to the west.
That's correct.
So at least for a period of maybe some minutes, people who had been forced off copies 1 and 2 would have a time period where SAPS was no longer advancing on them, and they weren't fleeing away from SAPS, they were now choosing how they were going to respond to the situation.
Yes, and that's what's so unpredictable about this, is that that line's created for the police to regroup, to reassess what the strikers have done, to re-plan what is the next move, or to reorganize the forces before moving again forward to either redisperse into smaller groups should they be regrouping, or to go forward with the isolation or re-encircling of smaller groups, disarming and arresting.
I understand the purpose of the reorganization line, but at this point I just want to emphasize its geography.
Yes.
It's on the eastern side of copy 3.
Yes.
So it's not going to stop any regrouping of the protesters or a militant section thereof inside copy 3.
That's correct.
In fact, it's going to afford them a breather in which to take a decision whether or not to regroup inside copy 3.
As for the police, to do the similar...
Indeed.
Yeah.
And if the protesters regroup inside copy 3, you're now faced with a situation of having to clear people out of difficult terrain.
Yes, that would be so.
But at that point, your plan leaves everything, your plan essentially runs out in your own words. At that point, everything is left to the discretion of the operational commander.
If we're talking about copy 3, and we consider that we had a Brigadier Fritz in the air, we had a Brigadier Karlitz on the ground, both responsible for different elements, they knew what the plan was, and in essence, a structured secondary plan could be drawn for copy 3 at that time if the protest had moved there. But if not, as I say, I can't speak to what they did. I wasn't there, I didn't experience what they experienced, but it was a matter of just applying what they'd been briefed to do already on the previous 2 copies going forward again.
It's slightly different this time, Colonel, because on the first 2 copies, you've given detailed briefing instructions as to which unit is to go where and how, and so each unit knows where it has to go.
That's correct.
Now you're depending on an operational commander on the ground and an aerial commander in the air, Brigadier Fritz, to guide tactical forces to clear difficult terrain.
That's correct.
And you yourself have given no indications as to which forces must be deployed in any position.
No, it's at the discretion of the commanders on ground.
The operational commander, let's talk about the operational commander before we get to the aerial commander. The operational commander is going to be dealing with a situation that's much more fluid and less predictable than the starting situation on copies 1 and 2 for which you planned. You accept that?
Well, obviously he's going to have to wait to see what the strikers have done after the dispersion to decide on his follow-up action.
Yes.
Yes.
And he's going to have no way of seeing what's going on in copy 2. He's on the ground. He can't see around the whole copy. He can't see inside the copy.
That's correct, but again, that's why there was a smaller helicopter with Colonel Vermaak, which they had linked up to be able to speak to one another. Initially, I'd thought that Brigadier Fritz would be carrying out that role, but Colonel Vermaak took over the role in speaking directly to Brigadier Carlos during the operation.
Yeah, we'll get to Brigadier Fritz in a minute, but so you have an operational commander on the ground who has to deal ad hoc with a more fluid situation than you had to deal with planning at the beginning, who's going to depend on scene descriptions that are given to him from a helicopter, from what he hears on a helicopter. He doesn't have a visual picture of anything. And he's going to be constrained by a radio system that you knew had flaws in it, or had weaknesses in it.
I think the weakness at that time was one channel. The fact that the communication was a problem earlier in the operation, where the radio was breaking up at times, was either due to the power lines or due to the fact that the operational commander didn't have a powerful enough radio system, which was installed in his vehicle before they actually commenced with the operation.
But one channel for this situation is quite a weakness. Let me put to you why I say that is so. All of the information that the operational commander needs to receive is going to have to come along that channel.
That is so.
All of the orders that he's going to have to issue on the basis of that information are also going to have to come along the same channel.
That's correct.
So when he's issuing orders, he can't get information at the same time.
That is so, but it's the pace of this operation will run at the pace that you drive it at.
And if anybody else wants to provide feedback in the course of the operation, they can only do so at the expense of shutting down both the information to the operational commander and the operational commander's capacity to issue orders,
Well,
for as long as they convey
yes.
their information.
But again, you're anticipating that the radio frequency needs to be jammed at all times. I'm not saying that is necessarily the case, and I'm trying to be careful not to infringe upon what these men were experiencing at the time, because I think that's unfair for me to comment on that. But the fact that one channel only available with this, I think there may have been a secondary channel for emergency if the channel went down, is not ideal. As we know, there should have been more, but there were restrictions with regard to the actual repeaters available to the police to be used in that area.
Chair. Just to help us follow what case you are to meet, is the one-channel weakness a function of saying there were more channels than available, or is it theory that is regardless of the reality?
It's saying the case that SABs have to meet on this front is that they have had a plan which, at least insofar as scene 2 was concerned, contained no directions, no provisions at all to begin with. And so, in fact, it wasn't a plan. What it was a plan for scene 2 that the operational commander and hopefully an aerial commander and maybe an eye in the sky will control scene 2 on a radio. And there is an inherent weakness in that plan if there is only one radio channel available. That's the relevance of one radio channel. It's not saying you should have arranged for 40 radio channels. It's saying that if you only have one radio channel, this is a very big problem for this plan.
I'm afraid that's precisely my difficulty, Chair. Is the case being made that because there's only one radio channel in that environment, an operation of this kind should not have been undertaken?
No, the case is being made that if people like Colonel Scott had enough time to reflect on this plan, they would have anticipated that there wasn't a plan for scene 2 and that there was a very real risk that a scene 2 would eventuate. And in that context, they would have taken a range of possible steps. The one is they might possibly not have planned for a reorganization line at the point that we see it there. They might have planned for a different reorganization line that was designed to cut off access to Copy 3 and to remove the threat of a re-entrenchment of the strikers at Copy 3. Another is that they may have made provisional tactical plans for the freeing of Copy 3. A third is that they would have taken much greater care to ensure that the aerial commander of the tactical forces, Brigadier Fritz, was in position to exercise control over the tactical forces at Copy 3. Instead, as we know from a cross-examination a month ago, Brigadier Fritz wasn't at Copy 3 or Scene 2 at any stage exercising aerial command until all but one of the victims at Copy 3 had already been killed. So that is the case that SABS has to meet. But I've heard your responses, Colonel, but I also in this context want to take issue with the refrain that was fairly familiar in Major General Annandale's evidence and that is familiar from my learned friend Mr. Semenya, which is the suggestion that the plan would have worked had it not been disrupted. Because in my submission, that can never be an explanation for what happened at Scene 2. It can possibly account for some of what happened at Scene 1, we'll get to that later, but it can never account for what happened at Scene 2. And I want to take you to some slides in this respect, which I submit show that nothing that happened at Scene 2 was affected by the disruption of the plan at Scene 1. And the first slide is slide 181, which shows what your plan was. So this is what your plan was on the assumption that it wouldn't be disrupted. And we can see, I'm going to try and flag on the, we can see the barbed wire line running up as I'm marking it. It's, I forget we had an argument about the color of these nyalas. How would you describe the color of those nyalas?
As red.
It's the orange line running between the 6 red nyalas. We have the armored dispersion forces set up to the north come northeast of Kopi 2. We have the TRT in support behind those armored forces, and we have directions as to where those armored forces are to move once the dispersion action takes place, the blue arrows. Now if we move to slide 223, we see what the situation was after scene 1. If we can just go to 223. And now, if I can mark, we have the barbed wire line running from the right-hand side through the barbed wire Nyala trailer, which is Nyala 2, on a line to the barbed wire Nyala trailer 3, and all the way through to the western edge of the small kraal where Nyala 4 is. Is that correct?
That's correct.
It should have run for maybe another 30 meters to the east in accordance with your plan. Is that correct?
Yes.
But for the purposes of what's happening now, that has major consequences for scene 1, but scene 1 is history now. For the purposes of what is happening now, it's not going to have any consequence. The failure of the barbed wire to stretch another 30 meters at the small kraal. Will you accept that?
What I maybe must just highlight is that what we see in place now is the public order policing line. The briefing was that they were to exit their vehicle, and they was to be on foot between the vehicles, for instance. That never happened. They remained in their vehicles. What was supposed to be behind that public order policing line, if it were going to go according to plan, would have been a TRT line, and be just behind them the SDF and NIU line.
We have SDF forces here.
They've joined the line of armored vehicles at this stage.
Indeed. But this line over here, are you saying there is...
This over here and over there is going to mean a hang of a lot to people who have to read this record in due course.
This line of...
absolutely nothing to them, in fact.
of Caspers and... Of a Casper, a water cannon, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Nyalas to the north of Kopi 2, on the left-hand side of this picture, northeast of Kopi 2. In what material respects was that line compromised from doing its job that you had anticipated for it?
I think the only thing that differs from what I'd envisioned, as I say, besides members being out their vehicles so the force continuum could be exercised that way, was just that the strikers are obviously not in the position that they were envisioned to be in for the dispersal action. But other than that, and I think I mentioned it earlier, the police kept on trying to bring the plan back onto the rails as they'd understood it. And this was probably one of those attempts, albeit not according to the letter.
Let's look at those attempts, because you describe them in your statement from paragraph 84 of what the plan should look like. The police dispersion line would form up north of the Koppies and push from north to the south, turning the dispersion line towards the west, towards the open fields. Well, we've got a dispersion line formed up to the north here, and we're about to see it move from the north to the south. The next stage of your plan was the dispersion line would need to be split into 3 parts to take 3 different paths as was determined by the terrain. The left path going around the bottom of Kopi 1. I'm reading from page 84, paragraph 1311. The middle path turning between Kopi 1 and 2, and the right path being to the right of Kopi 2. And then in paragraph 85, page 85, 13.12, I showed a geographical feature, a dry riverbed running from north to south on the western side of Koppies 1 and 2, where the police dispersion line had to stop the dispersion action and reorganize. Now, what you describe in those 2 paragraphs as your plan is broadly what took place. Would you accept that?
Yes.
So if we go to slide 223, which we've just looked at, we see the dispersion line formed up to the north. And the unfolding of the plan, broadly in accordance with your description, is described in slides 225 to 229. So let's go to 225. And on 225, we see the push from north to south, the beginnings of the push from north to south. So you have a split in the dispersion line. The dispersion line, it was planned that the dispersion line would split into 3 parts. In fact, it only splits into 2 parts because there are no longer any protesters on copy 1. So there's no need for the dispersion line, the third arm of the dispersion line, to split, to go round to the south of copy 1, between copy 1 and the power station. So that split doesn't take place because there's no longer a need for it. Instead, you get it split into 2. The one split running to the north of copy 1, which I'm highlighting now, and the other running, to the north of copy 2, and the other running between copies 1 and 2, which were 2 splits that you had designed. Then if we go to 226, again we see the 2 splits, and now we see some of the dispersion action with a water cannon, which is the vehicle with the blue streak ahead of it because it's splashing blue water, being used to disperse the mine workers who are gathered behind copy 2. If we move on to 227, it's more of the same. It's 2 arms and the dispersion action taking place through 228 and on to 229. And what happens at 229 is exactly in accordance with your plan. All of the strikers have been dispersed from copies 1 and 2 in a westerly direction, and now the police line is going to reform along the dotted yellow line, which is your reorganization line. At this point, and I emphasize at this point, is it not fair to say that the plan is back on track as you had originally conceived it?
The physical maneuvering of the police at this stage, yes. The anticipation of what the strikers were doing, not necessarily so. I expected a dispersion as in widely spread smaller groups. What they did do was remain together and move predominantly to copy 3, although a number of them had already retreated to copy 3 after scene 1.
Yes, but I'm talking about what the instructions were about what your plan was to do,
yes.
Not about... there is nothing that your plan was designed to do differently than what we see there. Is that not correct?
That's correct. They were to get to that line, stop, as I say, wait for the forces that were behind them to catch up or to see who was coming through that didn't have arrested persons in their position, and then re-look forward at what was going on in front of them and take decisions on how to further go ahead with the phase 3 of...
Indeed. And by this point, whatever disruption the events that led to scene 1 have caused has now been overcome by SABC. They're back on track with your plan.
Well, it's again, the TRT is missing. The NIU's taken up the role of the STF. So although vehicle-wise and so on, they're not 100% according to plan, but they're trying to keep the strategy going according to how they were briefed.
And it's at this point that the plan runs out. At this point, there's a handover to the operational commander.
Yes.
And from this point on, your plan has no detail at all.
No. From here on, it's at the discretion of the operational commanders, both of them, depending on the response of the strikers.
So I want to put to you that scene 2 and what happened at scene 2 is in no material respects causally linked to the disruption of the plan at scene 1. Do you accept that?
Yes, I can accept that.
I then want to move on and maybe answer some questions about why what happened at scene 2 did happen at scene 2. Hopefully you'll be able to help us answer them.
The witness is going to give the answers and you're going to give the questions, Mr. Justice, is that right?
It is correct.
You might prefer that,
I
but
forget
you
my
like-
station from time to time, Chairperson. Now, we've just recounted how your plan didn't have specific provisions for scene 2 at all because in the circumstances, and I want to emphasize, I'm not wanting to apportion blame for you. On the contrary, I'm wanting, you've heard what I've said earlier, I'm suggesting that this is something that you would have picked up had you had reasonable time to reflect on the matter. But your plan had no provisions for for copy 3. That's correct.
Not in the planning, no.
Not in the plan. But the purpose of the plan was to disperse the protesters into the open areas to the west.
That's correct, yes.
So if protesters got holed up in copy 3, that was a problem for the plan, and it was important for the logic of the plan to get them out of copy 3 as quickly as possible. Would you accept that?
It depends. I mean, we can't dictate the actions of the strikers again. Again, it would have been, in my point of view, the role not of necessarily POPs to have to move into the bushes, but similarly to copies 1 and 2, to have tactical teams move through that are more proficient at carrying out high-risk arrests.
But the tactical teams for high-risk arrests need some planning. You accept that? Planning and organization.
It's something which, and I can speak from experience, in something like this is what us as tactical officers can do, can arrange immediately on ground, because you've got standard operating procedures where we either work in 2s or we go up to working in 4s, 6s or more. And we are taught to clear areas like that specifically when coming across suspects or perpetrators, specific tactics on how to approach and how to deal with them. So it's not something that one would need to sit down and to brief people on extensively. It would simply be a briefing of positioning again and a quick expectation from the commander, and then he would need to keep the organization or the coordination of those forces moving through that environment.
Well, let me go back a step. The purpose of the plan was to encircle, isolate, or what the plan hoped to achieve was that isolated protesters, having been dispersed, could then be encircled by small groups of SABC members and arrested and disarmed.
Yes.
Now, for that purpose to be achieved, it's much easier and more convenient for SABC if the protesters are out in open areas than if they are holed out in or dug in copy 3.
That's true.
So if protesters get to copy 3, for the purposes of the plan, it seems to me that it would be most advantageous to try to flush them out of copy 3 into the open areas rather than to try to engage them in copy 3.
You know, again, I've got to watch how I answer, because I mean, I could put commanders who were on the ground and under pressure at the time. I have the benefit of hindsight, and I possibly would have done things slightly differently to what they would, having a different background, a different experience. But, and I'm hesitant to mention that because it could be used against them. Why didn't they think of this, and why didn't they do that? And so I'm not sure where to draw the line, Chairperson, with responding to certain, and in the same time not trying to withhold anything from the Commission either, because it would simply be my point of view.
Colonel, I'm only asking you for your opinion as a planner of these sorts of operations. Obviously, you can't speak to the individual choices that were faced by individual members on the ground and the individual circumstances that they faced. You don't even know that. But in broad principle, would you agree with my proposition that in terms of the logic of the plan, if strikers entrenched themselves in Kopi 3, it would be easier to deal with that situation if it was possible to flush them out of Kopi 3 into the open fields than to try to deal with that situation in Kopi 3 itself?
It would be, yes.
And consistent with that, if one is wanting to flush strikers out of Kopi 3, it's important to leave the strikers an exit route from Kopi 3 as opposed to surrounding them in Kopi 3.
If it was a flushing action, that would be the case, yes. But I must also maybe just emphasize, because again, I'm probably anticipating where you're going, but the police members were briefed from that side that besides protecting the informal settlement, that they needed to have a filtering line, that it was not necessary to do anything to people who were unarmed. Only people who were armed with sharp-edged weapons and possibly looking like they had firearms needed to be apprehended. So, again, I don't see that team coming in from the west as necessarily a blocking team. They were a filtering line. Anybody that had no issue with laying down their arms was permitted to walk straight past.
Well, let's take them one at a time, because actually two teams, it's not one team. You're talking about Captain Kidd, as I understand it.
Yes.
Now, what was his job in terms of the plan and in terms of the briefing? Can you describe it for the Commission?
He had with him public order policing members that didn't have armoured vehicles. Thus, they were not utilised in the dispersion action because they would have nowhere to have gone. As well as a couple of K9 members, I think, without dogs, and he had TRT members. So they were sort of a conglomerate of units that were with him. And he was tasked to move from forward holding area 2 to the informal settlement to the southwest of the Koppies, small informal settlement, and for the same purposes that we didn't want emotional or possibly violent strikers running into Nkaneng. We didn't want the same effect at the small settlement to the southwest. And he was tasked to set up a type of filtering line around that to protect it and to not permit violent groupings moving into that settlement.
Colonel, if we go to your slides of operational deployments, and we go to slide 144. And I must emphasize at the outset that this is a phase 2 briefing, not a phase 3 briefing. But as I understand it, Captain Kidd's group was the remnants of the group that was originally Lieutenant Colonel Pitzi's group.
That's correct.
And Lieutenant Colonel Pitzi, along with a detachment from that group, had joined, I think it was some of the armored vehicles. I mean, he brought armored vehicles into support lines, if I remember correctly.
Yes, they formed the northern flank of armored vehicles.
Those four vehicles on the northern side of the negotiation group. So the tasking of Captain Kidd for phase 2 is set out in this slide, which doesn't spill over onto the next page. In what respects had that tasking changed, if any, by phase 3? You can look at what's set out on the slide.
Well, again, bullet, are we talking about the comments block now?
The comments block, indeed.
The deploying of the reserve tactical forces on command of the JOC to the neutral area to assist the operational commander.
That's already happened,
that's happened.
with Lieutenant Colonel Pizzi going up to
The
take his
remainder
form.
of them at Ford Holding Area 2, or if that contingent was still there, will be responsible for the defense of initial protection of vulnerable targets to the west of the protester gatherings. And this was actually considering targets possibly like I think it's K3.
The career mine.
Yeah, the mine infrastructure to the west.
But also the informal settlement. Is that correct?
Well, if that became a threat, we didn't see it in phase 2 necessarily as a threat.
But I'm asking you how it changed
yes,
to phase 3.
It changed into phase 3. The tasking specifically became the informal settlement.
So
We see that in 182. You look at slide 182, Exhibit L. This is now stage 3 briefing to commanders, and the second bullet is commander of the teams at FH2, TRT, POP, and the K9 unit. That's Captain Kidd's group.
That's correct, Chairperson.
So there we are told what they had to do.
Yes,
That was their briefing.
that was their briefing at phase 3, stage 3.
thank you, Chairperson.
Anything about going to take any action at scene 2, or to disperse people, or to arm people, or anything of that kind?
No, that's I didn't brief them to do that.
No, it wasn't their task, was it?
It was not. It was not tasked to them in the planning. Yes.
No.
Can we move then to Major Naidu's tasking?
You'll find
General
he
Naidu.
was a general.
Major General Naidu. I apologize, Major General Naidu. Major General Naidu's tasking. And can you describe what Major General Naidu's tasking was in relation to phase 3?
Again, to the best of my recollection, he was to move what was the forward holding area 1 grouping, which was made up of numerous units within SAPS, as well as units of the emergency medical services, closer to initially where the immediate reaction area 1 was, so that should there be a requirement for medical attention, for that matter, it's just out of planning. I commonly do it anyway to have the fire brigade as part of that, etc., so that he would be closer, and he was essentially to be, if I can explain it in these terms, like a boom gate. As commanders on the front would call for medical attention, so he would release the medical personnel who would go to meet at a specific place. If there was obviously danger toward them, and the groupings that were dealing with danger couldn't come to get the medical personnel because we have to consider their safety, he would send an escort with them, and they would go to meet at a specific point where they would be received and taken to. This is the again, from the planning perspective that I have. And then obviously he was holding on to the crime scene analysis and those type of after the fact phase 4 or stage 4 as it became, to release them at an opportune time.
So it wasn't his function to get involved in the encirclement and dispersion action. It was his function to protect, shall we call it, support services or ancillary services that would have to that may have to perform functions in the course of the operation.
That is the briefing given to him. And again, I just want to emphasize that I know that these officers went beyond their briefings, but it's at their discretion, and they would obviously need to give the reasoning why they did that. Because I don't want to put it onto record or into place now that Colonel Scott has said you shouldn't have, and I wasn't there to experience what they experienced or saw or made their decision based on.
I appreciate that, Colonel, and the officers in question will have the opportunity, if they so desire, to explain their choices.
I take it, am I correct in thinking that Major General Naidu's briefing is contained in the 3rd bullet in slide 184?
That's a very, obviously for a presentation, just a small bulleted part of it, yes, Chairperson.
But part of it, what else was there?
What
What part of his briefing isn't reflected here?
Well, and I think it shows in my statement, but specifically he had dog handlers who did have dogs in their possession. He had the mounted unit, and what I'd envisioned the role was for each of these, utilizing the dogs to help between the rocks to find possibly firearms or weapons that had been hidden. If there were specific difficult arrest scenarios which were dangerous to approach, the dogs could be utilized for those as well. And of course then the roles of the mounted unit in dominating areas that had already been cleared as such, and being fast response to other areas if there were isolated policemen that were in trouble. So as I say, he had a numerous grouping of people under his control that he would need to have released at certain times on the call of the operational commanders at the front.
I mean, it's a question that we can put to Brigadier Carlitz in due course, but are you aware of any call from Brigadier Carlitz or from the JOC for that matter, for either Captain Kidd or Major General Naidu to come to the front?
I can only speak to obviously what I heard on the radio, and I didn't hear any call, but I have to also state that this is based on memory. It's also based on the fact that there was a time period during the operation for about 4 minutes odd that at least us in the JOC, I'm not sure if it was throughout the whole operation, but we were cut off totally from radio comms from the field. It sounded as though somebody was keying their radio and holding it in so that nobody else could speak.
Well, we're unaware of any for Captain Kidd. We are aware of one for Major General Naidu, but that relates to a call to bring medical personnel to Scene 1 after the Scene 1 shootings. We're certainly not aware of any call either to Captain Kidd or Major General Naidu to take forces to participate in the encirclement and dispersion action. In fact, we're aware of an instruction to the contrary, and if I can take you there to Brigadier Fritz's first statement, G8. G8. And if we can go down to paragraph 6. There, Brigadier Fritz describes an incident which we've seen both on the videos of Captain Nell in CC29, approximately 10 seconds in, and on Colonel Buerta's video, approximately 6 minutes 38 seconds in, when he gestures to the Captain Kidd's line. And he says, about 10 minutes into our flight, I told the ALEO to instruct the police on the ground to go in a northerly direction so as to prevent the protesters from running towards the Korea mine. So he wanted Captain Kidd's line to move up to the north to cut off the route to the Korea mine. I did so because the protesters were running with weapons in their hands, and the mission that day was to disarm them. I was not aware what was going on and why they were running. I thought they might create a problem for members of the public in the Korea mine area, especially if they were violent. The ALEO, and that would be Sergeant Fenter, did so. And you recall on those videos, there's images of Sergeant Fenter going out in a harness, waving at Captain Kidd's line. Yes. The police ran instead in the northeasterly direction. And now, Captain Kidd running in a northeasterly direction is going to take him where?
Obviously to copy 3.
Yes, to copy 3. I did not know why they went there, says Brigadier Fritz. Now, Brigadier Fritz was the aerial commander.
Yes.
And his function was to issue commands to people on the ground. Is that not so?
Yes. Again, he would probably explain why he spoke to the KID group, but the KID group had a specific tasking. The groups that he was to command were specifically the STF, NIU, and the TRT lines that were following the POPs dispersion line.
I'm not at this stage questioning Brigadier Fritz's decision to try to command Captain Kidd to cut off the access route to the Korea mine by moving to the north. What I'm wanting you to confirm is that it was Brigadier Fritz's function to issue orders about the movement of troops like Captain Kidd's troops.
But again, Forward Holding Area 2's people had a specific tasking. So to say like Captain Kidd's troops, Captain Kidd had a specific tasking of what to do.
Well, what authority would the aerial commander have had? I mean, everybody starts off with a tasking. What authority does the aerial commander have to issue orders that will deviate from that tasking?
Well, again, if he was going to remove a function from the operation, we could be sitting in a different scenario today. If that had happened and people had moved through and that little informal settlement was attacked, or people therein were attacked that were felt not to be supporting the cause, then it would be a different role. So the briefing which is given to specific groupings of people, in other words, the Forward Holding Area 2 people, in my view, fell outside of the authority of Brigadier Fritz's jurisdiction.
So in terms of the operation, this was an order that Captain Kidd was, or an attempted instruction. Participate in the encirclement and dispersal action.
That's correct. Other than, as I say, the filtering line, protection line in front of that, which ultimately may have led to certain arrests in that environment of Captain Kidd's group.
But if I understand the primary function of Captain Kidd, it's to protect the informal settlement.
That's right.
And the informal settlement is approximately, well, it's more than a kilometre away from Kopi 3.
I don't think it's that far, but...
Well, it's a long distance from Kopi 3.
Yes.
And if he's going to be able to perform his primary function, any filtering line that he sets up will have to be set up relatively close to the informal settlement.
That's correct.
You see, both Major General Naidu and Captain Kidd took their forces into Kopi 3. And you'll recall that Major General Naidu took his forces, or the armed forces, not the support forces, into the southeast of Kopi 3.
Yes.
And Captain Kidd took his forces into the southwest of Kopi 3.
They extended further than that.
And up along the western side.
Yeah, some of these members were involved in the arrests which were made by Brigadier Karlitz's group way to the north. So
Captain Kidd's group essentially straddled almost a semicircle from the, in fact some of them were almost due south, in the bushes due south of Kopi 3, all the way on the western side of Kopi 3 to the north. Is that correct? Now, I want to put to you that these acts and decisions by Major General Naidu and Captain Kidd had two very unfortunate results. The first is that it had the result that Kopi 3 was surrounded by SAB's forces. So there was then no route out of Kopi 3 by strikers inside the Kopi. And it wasn't possible, despite valiant efforts by the Northwest Water Cannon, to flush them out because there was no escape route. Would you accept that?
But I think we must also move from the premise that the very people that are surrounding them are not intending to use any lethal force. They are standing there simply as police officials wanting to do their job. It's not a military ring who are planning to commit it.
Well, Colonel, you've got to put yourself for a moment into the mind of a mine worker who's just seen 16 people killed by R5 rifle shots at scene 1. Several other people killed in a hail of bullets, of hundreds of bullets at scene 1. They may not know what Captain Kidd's intentions are. What they've seen is a lot of their colleagues have been shot dead and others injured in a massive gunfight. Well, not a gunfight, in a massive volley of gunfire from the police at scene 1. So if they see themselves surrounded by police at Kopi 3, I think it's fair to assume that they're going to be much less likely to run out into the open fields than if there is an open exit route. But that's a matter for argument. But the second consequence is the one that is one that I do want to take up with you, which is that the second consequence is that the bulk of the lethal and potentially lethal shooting at scene 2 was done by members of SABC who, in terms of your plan, shouldn't have been there or weren't intended to be there. And for that, I'd like us to go to slide 257. Of Exhibit L. Now, this is your slide of munitions expended at scene 2. And you've broken it up between warning shots, which are split between 9mm and R5, and shots towards, which are the category that I will describe as the lethal or potentially lethal shots, which are split between 9mm and 5.6, and then there's less than lethal weaponry on the right-hand side. And we've my learned friend Mr. Budlander canvassed this slide a little with Major General Annandale, and in the course of that cross-examination, the Major General picked up an arithmetical error. And the arithmetical error is that if you add up the 9mm shots under towards, which has a subtotal of 49, in fact, you get to 52. That threw out Mr. Budlander's percentages somewhat. And that then makes the total under towards 123. And we're now talking about shots that are aimed at people. That's towards. Is that correct? You're nodding your head,
yes,
Major General. Now,
To the Colonel. To be unkindly pointing that out, but just to be accurate.
I'm sorry, Colonel. Maybe I shouldn't apologize. Colonel, in terms of the